Dr. Bateson is an anthropologist that studies the strangest of all possible groups, namely ourselves. When you read her books, through her essays and her interviews, you realize, well, this is talking about us and our culture and not a faraway land. And I think that's probably the most difficult of all groups. It's sort of related to the question, does a fish know its swims in water? So after you read her books, yes, you do know that you swim in water. So thank you. Please welcome Dr. Mary Catherine Bateson.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Got it.
We learned.
You learned. We can learn.
Yes,
Okay.
we can.
You know, the problem of cybernetics is it is not an academic discipline that belongs in a department. It is an attempt to correct an erroneous way of looking at the world and at knowledge in general. And there are all sorts of abstruse and sophisticated things that can be done with it. But at some level, what we would like is to affect what people think is common sense. Things that they take for granted, that in fact are problematic. About causality, about purposes, about relationships. Universities don't have departments of epistemological therapy. They have groups of people with ways of seeing the world that have been built up over long periods of time and get transmitted and elaborated and are sometimes marvelously useful and insightful, but there are errors that we live with in our what we regard as common sense. Well, fairly recently I got interested in the question of how are people thinking about their later adult years, given that we added 30 years to average life expectancy in the 20th century. And a lot of people were saying, oh, 30 extra years of being old. Just parenthetically, that's not what it is. It's 30 years inserted before what we have regarded as traditional old age. And we haven't yet figured out how to reorganize our lives, and that's not my topic today. But being an anthropologist, I thought I'd better hang out with some gerontologists, find out how they talk. And one of the things that I learned very rapidly is that the big issue, and I think many people here will recognize it, is I want to be independent. I don't want to depend on anyone when I get old. Especially not my children. And that's very interesting because if you look at child-rearing literature in our culture, the theme that comes up again and again is independence training. You look at Piaget or Brazelton or whoever, whether they're talking about cognitive development, they're talking about the child becoming progressively more separate. And what strikes me, and I think you will all agree with me, is that independence is an illusion. There are certain kinds of dependency that one wants to avoid, perhaps. But the nature of life is interdependence. And what we should be saying to people as they get older is, yes, you will need more help. And we will try and arrange society so that you feel you are making a contribution. Let's be sure that people's experience continues to be that of interdependence. I want to spell this out a little bit in relation to child rearing. Because I think people's assumptions start very, very early. We are the only country on earth that thinks that what you should do with a newborn baby is put it in a bed, crib, by himself or herself, and put that in a room with no other people. This is basically unknown in the history of the human race. Only it's spreading. We're spreading it. And nice young couples spend a lot of time decorating the baby's room with mobiles and pictures and curtains and things like that, without recognizing that the message they are giving is, you are alone. My mother studied child rearing in 5 pre-literate cultures before I was born. And she came back with a lot of ideas. She looked around for a pediatrician that would let her do what she wanted. She didn't like being told how to do things. And she got Ben Spock. And she picked Ben Spock because she heard that he'd been psychoanalyzed. He might have some insight. And she had a whole series of very unconventional ideas. She was going to breastfeed. In 1939, which is when I was born, the only women in the United States who breastfed were women in extreme poverty and ignorance. Middle-class women did not breastfeed. And they were instructed by their doctors to feed the baby on a rigid schedule, bottle feed on a rigid schedule, and don't pick the baby up if it cries, because that will spoil it. Now, what this was the most profound rejection of a symbiotic pattern between mother and child. If the mother breastfeeds and feeds when the baby is hungry, the milk increases or decreases in response to the infant's hunger. It's a self-corrective system. But no. And every infant is hungry on a slightly different schedule. Now, interestingly enough, one of the things my mother said, she said, Ben never understood self-demand feeding. Because when you read in Spock's baby book, about demand feeding. What you get is the notion that you nudge the baby onto a regular every 4-hour schedule. You start out responding to the baby's cries, and then you ease it onto a standard schedule. What Margaret was saying is write down every time you feed the baby and for how long. Look for a pattern in the baby's demand. There is order immanent in the child's physiology. So what you want to do is discover that immanent order. Sometimes you can only discover it by looking at the pattern over a 48-hour period, not a 24-hour period. But then, as she said to me when I had my daughter, when you find the pattern, it is the child's pattern that you want to underline. You're not going to edge it onto something prescribed by some doctor. You're going to realize, oh, the baby wants to feed it at 2 in the morning instead of midnight, whatever, and respond. And guess what? The minute you begin to get into the baby's pattern, the mother's milk starts coming down at the time when the baby's going to be hungry. All right? And then you just follow the pattern, and it changes over time, and some feedings dwindle, less interested, some become more important, and so on and so forth. But the whole version of self-demand feeding that has come into the public understanding through Spock's writing is the self-demand feeding is a temporary arrangement until you can get the child onto a standard schedule. It's an improvement. It's better than enforcing a fixed schedule immediately. But what it does not create, and I think this is a very important educational issue, it does not, and I don't know what this is like in an infant's head, but at some level, the development of a harmonious pattern of being fed when one is hungry and held establishes a kind of unity between mother and child that we are on the whole in favor of breaking up. Okay? So one of the things that I'm in New Hampshire. Don't have easy access to a good library, so I would have done more of this if I could. Piaget talks a lot about children beginning to understand causality. Well, you can see they experiment on you all the time. You know, I'm going to drop this. Is Mama going to pick it up? I'm going to do it again. Science. I made a discovery about the universe. I'm going to do it again. Okay? You could see infants experimenting to see what's going to happen if I do this or that, and learning to manage it. But in the case of the handling of feeding, what we are doing is saying to the infant, forget about a symbiotic relationship between you and your mother. This is going to be legislated from outside and enforced, and you're going to be let cry if you don't move on to the schedule of society. The fact is that in very, very subtle ways, we teach an extreme individualism, a sense of separateness. You've got to stand on your own feet. You've got to be independent. And we give children the experience of a command and control system instead of the experience of working out over time a mutual system. No wonder so many people found cybernetics and systems theory unintelligible.
Still do.
Our parents, not mine, our parents beat the awareness of interdependence, of being part of a single system, out of us from day one. It turns out to be a fairly novel thing to say to people. Independence is an illusion. We are all dependent on other human beings and on the quality of the air and the water and the planet we live on. And if we cannot be aware of that interdependence, we will act in ways that disrupt it, which of course is what we're doing. So actually I think kindergarten is a little late to start learning cybernetics. I think probably at some level what the infant experiences before birth may be the truest reflection of how the world actually is, of being totally dependent on an environment. One of the things that Gregory kept saying is, we're always talking about the wrong unit of survival. We talk about the survival of individuals or of species, polar bears, bison, whatever it is. The unit of survival is the organism in its environment. That is what has to be protected, that relationship. And if the habitat is destroyed, the species will not survive. It's a relationship. And then you look at the discussion of children developing what's called a theory of mind. It's not what Gregory would call a theory of mind. But it's realizing that other people have purposes separate from yours. And object permanence. You know, an infant, if you take a rattle away and hide it, it's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. At a certain point, the infant knows to look for it. Knows that even if I can't see it, it's somewhere. And when we play peekaboo with babies, I hope you all play peekaboo with a baby occasionally. It's very good for the soul. And when we play peekaboo, we're offering the child the moment to decide, when mommy disappears, is she gone forever? No, she's still here. And then, of course, in school, we divide things up in separate subject matter in highly conventional ways that miss the interconnections. Ideally, what we would like would be to have an awareness of systemic interconnectedness, the basis of common sense. In fact, what we call common sense in this particular culture emphasizes separateness and lineal causality. You can isolate a problem and act on it according to your purposes, and not worry about side effects. Let's DDT the mosquitoes. Got a problem with mosquitoes? The solution is kill the mosquitoes. Doesn't matter that it kills the birds too. In a sense, that's what we're pursuing. That's what we would like to get into people's consciousness. You know, when you think about it this way, virtually every one of the religious traditions that I know about has a fundamental teaching about interconnectedness. Very often it's expressed in terms of kinship. We are all descended from the same ancestor, Abraham. We are all a single body, the body of Christ. We are descended from other species, the different clans, maybe one clan from the kangaroo and another clan from the thunder or lightning and another clan from the ocean. So that we, as a community, represent the unity of the natural world because we are connected and each have specific relationships. That's called totemism, essentially. When you look at it, these different formulations of connectedness, they see the stories are different, the doctrines are different, people quarrel about them, but in each case, and again, and of course I think in a sense Buddhism expresses this sense of interconnectedness most effectively. What religions are doing is saying you have an intuition that you were not separate, that you were part of something. So what I think I want to say to you is, if we're thinking about education, what we should think about is, what is the meaning of the concept part of? What is the meaning of it to a newborn infant, a not yet born infant who really is part of the mother's? What does it mean to be part of a marriage, a family, a community, the American Society for Cybernetics? And within that understanding, not setting it aside and saying, well, that's cute, it might be interesting on Sunday to think about it, but the rest of the time I'm on my own. How we're going to embed that in education so that it becomes embedded in decision making, in what happens in the world of economics. Economists are full of assumptions, and they are assumptions of separateness and competition. One of the things that's going on in evolutionary theory at the moment in biology is an increasing understanding of how much of evolution comes about by symbiosis. Some of you probably know the work of Lynn Margulis, who died last year.
Yeah.
And she came up with the notion that the nucleus in the cell, hey, everybody went to high school probably and looked through a microscope at a single-celled paramecium or amoeba, right? And they have a nucleus, and the genetic information and a lot of other stuff is in the nucleus that runs things. Well, in the earliest evolution of life, those are called eukaryotic cells, cells with a nucleus. And the earliest forms of life did not have a nucleus. How did the nucleus evolve? Random mutations? No. The nucleus evolved by prokaryotic, non-nucleus organisms taking up residence in others. In other words, a eukaryotic cell, a cell with a nucleus, is a symbiotic element. And it turns out that a great many cells have what are called organelles inside them that represent ancient cooperations. The green plants, on which all of our food chains depend, right? Chlorophyll. Well, what happened was that the chloroplasts in the cell were originally like algae and took up residence in larger cells that provided structure. So the chloroplasts provided food, and the larger cell provided structure. And that's all been going on for millions of years. And it's interesting to note that although Lynn Margulis's work is now, it's even in the high school textbooks, saying that the early origins of cells with a nuclei came about by symbiosis. That her first attempt to publish her research was turned down again and again and again because everybody knew that evolution took place by random change and competition. And we live in a society in the United States of America that assumes that competition is a law of nature. Well, there is competition. I mean, it isn't that it never happens. But the point is that cooperation is also a law of nature. And unfortunately, though the biologists are catching on, the economists are still stuck. And the kindergarten teachers are stuck. Nursery school. When I was in nursery school, a very good nursery school that has been a source of a lot of research and so on, a teacher came to my mother and said, "We're very worried about Kathy." And my mother said, "Well, what's wrong?" And the teacher said, "When she's playing with a toy and someone takes it away from her, she finds another toy." Doomed. Right? You're supposed to fight for your toy. You're supposed to assert yourself. Stand on your own feet. You can take a course in assertiveness training. And the search for knowledge in our society is as much distorted by the competitive model as our other areas of life. Or look at athletics. People will tell you that team sports are important in education because they teach kids to work with others on a team. But all of the reporting that you hear about athletics emphasizes the individual players. Have you noticed that? I mean, basketball is a sport that requires incredible coordination. But that's too sophisticated for most of the broadcasters to talk about, so they talk about how many baskets, how many whatevers. Right? They talk about the individuals. I don't have an answer for this, but I have really come in the last year. I hadn't thought this through until I started listening to people in their 80s talking about the necessity. Life is not worth living unless you're independent. We are a society that is, to put simply, counter-cybernetic, that is constantly sending us the message, don't look at the whole system. Don't notice the context. Don't look at the broader relationships and interactions. Don't think of yourself as part of the natural world. think of humans as different from and against or ruling over, quote, nature. You know, maybe sometimes we don't realize how revolutionary, how profoundly dissonant with the culture cybernetics is. And I think the only way that that lesson is going to get across is when people see systems thinking applied to problems that they are experiencing. I meant to ask you all to help me out on something last night, and I forgot. I will do it today. I've been emailing back and forth with a friend who's trying to say, having read From Fair Side to Cybernetics, one of Gregory's papers, is how can we use cybernetics to think about the conflict in the Middle East? What suggestions can be made that will help? If you stop and think for a minute, you'll realize that the solutions that are being tried are not informed by systems thinking. It's us against them, which is a popular position in the world. And worth noticing, I think, my husband's Armenian, and so I've watched what's happened in Armenia following this breakup of the Soviet bloc. And it occurred to me at a certain point that the most militant people in Armenia are American Armenians going back. And the most militant settlers in Israel are American Jews. And not only that, I don't know how many people returned, but a lot of the money that supported the fighting in Northern Ireland was provided by American Irish. In fact, we as a society believe in violence as a way of addressing problems. And we're spreading that around the world. Just as we're modeling putting babies alone when they come home from the hospital. Actually, there's a good number of people taking the babies to bed with them now, which is a good thing. Women do not roll over on and suffocate their babies unless they are drunk or sick. Very drunk or very sick. It's a myth. It's a myth that promotes this separation business. So here's what I would suggest in terms of giving cybernetics away. My guess is that there aren't too many people in this room who would say, as their primary identification, I am a cyberneticist. That's because most of us teach in universities that don't have departments of cybernetics, and so we're in a department of, it could be mathematics, it could be sociology, it could be psychology, it can be computer science, but we all know that's not quite the same thing. A lot in business, management, right? I think what we need to do each and every one of us is undertake a project and publish on it that will be a specific application of one of the basic concepts of cybernetics. And then publish it in the journal of your home discipline, your other home discipline, with careful explanations and annotations and definitions of the terms you're using. It's wonderful to come to a meeting and talk to each other. But that is, I think, simply to take these terms and put them into circulation, correctly used, because the term feedback is not generally correctly used.
Thank you very much.
In the other disciplines. I don't, if you ask me, and I've been a dean of faculty, I mean, I know about university structure. The goal is not to have departments of cybernetics. The goal is infiltration, my friend. The goal is to offer to your colleagues that really have no idea what you're doing most of the time ways of thinking that will make them look at problems differently. And that, to me, yesterday I tried to respond to living with cybernetics. Today, I want to respond to giving cybernetics away. Don't save your wisdom for this group of colleagues. Get it out there. Get it understood. Apply it. You may have a lot of turndowns. Nice things have been said about my book, Our Own Metaphor. I think that was turned down by some 30 publishers. And it's now in its third edition. And I only had the energy to push it, because with the first edition, I don't think they published more than 2,000 copies. And it was really Knopf being kind to me. I mean, the editor had said, he encouraged me. He was the first person to turn it down. He said, it's not our kind of book. Then he said, all right, I'll do it. A year later, when I went back in desperation. But I was getting letters from people that said, I read your book, Our Own Metaphor. It has changed my life. I stole the library copy. And when I got the third one of those, I decided we had to get it back in print. So, the conversation of why cybernetics has not been absorbed has been going on for years. I hate to say it, I don't use the word cybernetics very often. I use systems theory. It's not satisfactory. I try and get cybernetics in somewhere in the neighborhood. But people think it's just about computers. They love computers, so they will pay attention to that and ignore what you're trying to say about how the world is structured, the nature of causality. Cybernetics is a change in our both epistemology and ontology, on our understanding of how the world works. And you know, there's no such thing as a department of how the world works. There's just disciplines that have traditions and look at pieces of the world. The one thing you're really trying to teach people is not to look at things piece by piece, but in their interrelationship with each other. And what I would say is take it to your home ground, be upfront about it, put examples out there, publish them in the journals of your discipline, and keep sending them out if they get turned down. Because if we can change what people think of as common sense, that is the real revolution. And that, incidentally, is what we have to do, I believe, to save our species and our planet. We have to adopt new ways of thinking and thinking together and cooperating to change the way we are acting, both in terms of environmental damage and interhuman violence. Because, my friends, what is most likely to be the result of global warming is warfare over resources and land that is quite likely to produce a nuclear winter. You know, it's not a light thing that I say that all religions teach connection. And that we, as Americans, have made a religion of non-connection. And that we do that not only individually in our lives, but in our scientific thinking and our political decision making. And it simply isn't true. That's what I say to people. There's no such thing as independence. Forget it. It's an illusion. So. Oh, but I started to ask a favor of you. Anyone who has started thinking or wants to think about the application of cybernetics to the Middle East conflict, there's just a chance that we may be getting together a group to study that and come up with some new ideas. I've been back and forth with people on email, and it looks as if something might happen. So please, if this is an area you think you have ideas about and you care about, you can always communicate with me by writing to my website, which is marycatherinebateson.com, or my Gmail, which is M as in Mary, C-A-T as in meow, and B-A-T as Batman and Robin, mcatbat@gmail.com. And I promised people that I've been talking to about this that I would put out a plea to you all.
You got it.
What can we do? For the last, grab me after.
All right.
Okay. For the last 2 or 3 years, I've been doing a lot of speaking about the 3 Abrahamic faiths, to try and get people to have some at least basic respect and recognition, some capacity to empathize between them. But I think something needs to be done much closer to the practical things at this point. I mean, that's a way of trying to defuse Islamophobia in this country, but that's a limited goal. We need suggestions.
Okay.
So either grab me, or email me, or just go home and think about it. It's about time.
Yes,
I mean,
it is.
we should be solving problems of conflict by suggesting new ways of looking at what's happening. Thank you.
Dr. Bateson has graciously agreed to take questions.
Doesn't mean I know answers. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, well, I guess I'm in a kind of unique situation here because I'm Iraqi Canadian, and in 2006, when the sectarian strife was at its peak, I started a petition calling for a UN supervision of census, population census, and the elections in Iraq. Because you see, I mean, everybody knows that a lot of the elections in the Middle East, maybe not all of them, but I think they're all of them actually, are a sham. And the least that we can
Like
do
the United States.
is just to make sure that the elections are clean in order to show the people that they have something they can control, they can sort of some kind of accountability. I spent a lot of money, a few $1,000s on Google Ads. All I got is 1,000 signatures. I couldn't move forward for that. Let me give you a little background because I'm sure you'll find it very interesting. In 2003, Russia and France suggested that Iraq to have UN supervision of the elections in Iraq, just UN supervision of the elections, not the census. But the census, I'll come back to that later. The United States didn't like it because of its local allies who did not want like clean elections, let's say. Okay, so later on, I read that the United States and Russia came to kind of an agreement over Chechnya. So Russia takes care of Chechnya, the United States takes care of Iraq. Forget about that suggestion. Something like that happened with France, so the whole thing scuttled. The election part, I have information that the plan not to have census is was instated before the 2003, call it invasion or liberation, whatever. There was a plan not to have accurate census because that will protect all the infringements, all the, the Kurds brought a lot of Kurds who are not Iraqis, the Shia, they brought some people who are not Iraqis. Anyway, they just wanted to kind of muddy the waters and have kind of free-for-all. So what I heard is Saddam Hussein, he's a bad man, he is. But before the invasion, he distributed 6 CDs, 6 copies with all the census information prior to 2003 to 5 or 6 major countries and the United Nations. And they said, look, these are the population of Iraq. Be careful, everything else that might not be. Anyway, so in order to kind of start clean, we got to have United Nations supervision over census and the elections. I could not do anything on my own.
You know, I'm pausing and thinking about that because we probably need to work for United Nations involvement in censuses and in elections on a global basis. We shouldn't pick out specific countries. We should have this information, particularly the census information. We should have it globally for planning food resources, dealing with energy issues, right? Address the problem at a higher level is what I'm trying to say.
I agree.
And so that it's not invidious. And I agree with you, this has been true in several Middle Eastern countries, that postponing the census is a way of not knowing really what the population is. But remember also that elections are only a good form of governance if people are willing to accept the results of the elections. And accept them with continuing respect for the other parties. And that is really the goal. And the problem is that elections as a substitute for warfare don't necessarily work, especially sectarian warfare. Anybody else? Yeah.
In an increasingly interconnected world through social media and other things, do you see any opportunities to hasten the demise of the power of the nation state in creating social change?
Well, I think the concept of the nation state is a terrible concept. It was a bad idea. And I think that is particularly conspicuous in the Middle East, where the lines, and in Africa, where the lines were drawn arbitrarily by colonial powers and don't reflect patterns of people's lives and interconnections. I think social media is already having an impact on people's awareness of what's happening in other places. Are we going to get rid of the nation state? I wish. I tell you, I don't think the nation state is going to disappear and a world government emerge. I think the resistance is too great. But I think one of the things that's happening that makes the world so difficult at the moment is groups, diverse groups within nations becoming increasingly self-conscious and connecting with related groups in other nations, so that Iraqi Shiites and Iranian Shiites and Shiites in Lebanon are all, and Syria, are all influencing each other. And what we're going to see is this huge increase in transnational connections that will make the nation, the boundaries of nations, less significant. Is that going to be enough? I don't know. Yes?
In a digital era where everything happens so fast, and in this interconnectedness that allows things to be global, do you think the system of governance that we have all over the planet, which we call democracy, is sufficient? Is it informed by cybernetics and system science? Or do we need to change it?
I think that is a very good question to ask and keep asking. Clearly, you can't just make a nation democratic overnight by introducing voting. Does anybody notice that we seem to think if they have elections, that means they're democratic? What's very clear is that, and it's particularly clear looking at the post-Soviet world, is that what we take for granted, which is an imperfect system, heaven knows, takes a lot of learning. It takes a long time to learn how to live with the imperfect democratic systems that we have. You can't just introduce them overnight. What we need is some careful study of the process of moving towards democratic patterns and what is needed to make that work. It's not really my field, but I think one of the tragedies of recent years was the advice of American economists to totally dismantle the centralized economic planning all at once and go for capitalism, which nobody knew how to do. The system got very corrupt. There was a period when a great many people suffered. We don't know how to make the transitions. But being dogmatic about you've got to have elections and that's going to solve everything is not going to solve everything. The elections will be corrupt. Yes.
I was just maybe more a comment. I'm surprised that we start talking about geopolitics and nation states when I thought your message was start with the kindergarten.
Before kindergarten.
I think we have a kind of kindergarten, and that is actually the internet, the new media, that is underground, and it can actually, and then we talk about elections. You're correct. I mean, actually, you told the story of your mother with two choices. What are they? You know, that is not, to me, government by the people. It's government by parties, or now by corporations. But I think what we should probably do more is, and I'd like to have your opinion, make the kindergarten in the internet, in Twitter, and build their a consciousness of the connection. Because people at this point, you know, assert only, you know, I like this or whatever, but there where you should start introducing cybernetics and make the connections that people are engaged in, and out of which a different kind of government by the people might arise.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So start with the kindergarten. And I would say maybe we should not talk about geopolitics. This is too big at this point, and we have no influence. We cannot talk to Russia versus United States. I mean, that I don't know if that works.
You know, I think good ideas, well stated, can have a real influence. They can have an influence on politicians, in the halls of power. They can spread through the internet. But I think part of what this group can do is to generate ideas and get involved in kindergartens. you know? But remember this. Intellectuals tend to believe that education is the way to bring about change. I find myself constantly reminding educators of the fact that education is a profoundly conservative institution in the large sense. Parents want their children to believe what they believe. They'd like them to be richer, but not to have different beliefs. Education was invented so the older people could pass on what they thought was true. Right? Okay. So now we have specialists who do it, and they may have different ideas about what's true from what the parents have. And it becomes a mechanism for change sometimes. But it is a very imperfect mechanism. And I think cybernetics belongs in kindergarten, and in first grade, and in second grade, and in third grade, and in high school, and in college, and graduate school. And that to believe that just to start in one place, you tried that. It became a very high-level specialty. Right? Now the problem is how to get it to go sink in. How to have it affect people's thinking at every level. And one of the things that and when I talk to people involved in educational reform, that I've come to believe is that if you want to change an institution, you need to make an input at every organizational level. You can't do it from the top, that's command and control, and it probably isn't going to work from the bottom unless there's people at the top that are already prepared to listen. So I say cybernetics belongs in kindergarten, but not only in kindergarten.
That's where it starts.
Okay, I think
Okay,
we'll have
thank
to-
you very much.
have to call it.